Today, we look at the Declaration of Independence. And here, as you can see on this title slide, we use the abbreviation DOI to denote the Declaration of Independence. Please understand that this is not an official abbreviation for the Declaration of Independence. Outside the friendly confines of this classroom, no one would know what you were referring to if you used the DOI abbreviation. Please understand that I introduce it here because if you're taking notes, repeatedly writing Declaration of Independence can be unnecessarily time-consuming and cumbersome, hence the abbreviation. So, for the purposes of notes, feel free to use the DOI abbreviation, but please know that it is not an official abbreviation. So while notes are fine, avoid using it in any formal work, as formal work should follow a more formalized writing style. Hopefully you recall that before the United States became its own independent nation, it was once governed and controlled by Great Britain or England. And at this time, Great Britain or England was still governed by a king, although that king shared governmental power with an English lawmaking body called Parliament. Now, despite what you may have heard, the American colonists had a fair amount of autonomy, or the ability to make decisions for themselves while living in the colonies. It is not as if the king or his royal representatives were roaming the streets of the American colonies, thrusting their fingers into the chests of the lowly colonists and ordering them about on a daily basis. Part of their autonomy was due to the distance relative to the colonies and the king. Remember, they were separated by a gigantic ocean, as they are today. Additionally, the technology, or lack thereof, during this time period also led to a fair amount of freedom for those living in the colonies. Now, there were governments that existed within the colonies, some of which were controlled by royal officials, but it's not as if the colonists lived an oppressive existence, constantly being harassed by English rule and laws. During this time period of colonial America, you may recall that the American/English colonists were not alone on the continent of North America. Just over the Appalachian Mountains lurked one of England's greatest rivals, the cheese-eating surrender monkeys known as the French. And eventually the rivalry, as it had in the past, ended up leading to physical conflict and ultimately war. Now, this war has a very confusing title because it's known as the French and Indian War, which might lead you to the incorrect conclusion that the French were fighting against the Indians or Native Americans. However, those of you who recall your 7th grade social studies experience may recall that in fact it was the French and the Indians fighting side by side against the English. And the reason for the alliance was quite simple. Everywhere the English went, the Native Americans were told to move along, whereas the French treated the Native Americans with a great deal more of respect. The French viewed the Native Americans as valuable business partners, trading manufactured European goods that the Native Americans couldn't otherwise get their hands on for animal pelts and furs, which the French transported back to Europe and sold for exorbitant prices. So the French and the Native Americans made for natural allies against the British. What was in dispute was the resource-rich area of land between claims made by the English, who were living up and down the east coast of what is today the United States, and the areas just west of the Appalachian Mountains, which you can see represented on the map by the alternating pink and blue lines. Now, unfortunately, if you were rooting for the Native Americans in this one, and also by default then the French, you are going to be sorely disappointed, as the winner of the French and Indian War will be the British. As a result of this war, the boundaries of the English colonies, remember, the United States does not yet exist, the boundaries of the English colonies are going to be significantly enlarged. On this slide, you can see all the striped territory that is now British territory. Never mind the fact that the native inhabitants still call this home. The French have now been pushed west of the mighty Mississippi. This was certainly the best case scenario for the British, emerging victorious and now the possessors of even more valuable territory in the New World. However, all was not golden, as wars are expensive. Even the victors must pay for the cost of their victory, and following the French and Indian War, England was left with massive war debt. The question that therefore arose was, where was the money to pay these debts? Because remember, soldiers need to be paid, soldiers need to be armed, and soldiers might need to be fed. Additionally, a navy might be needed to transport soldiers wherever the fighting is taking place, and all this costs money. And now England and the head of England, the king, are left with the problem of paying these debts. Fortunately, there is a method by which governments can secure increased revenue or income. It's the same today as it was back then. Where do governments get their money? Correctamundo, taxes. So the king and the British government basically have two choices. They could A, tax the citizens of England who live in the king's backyard, and by comparison to their brethren across the Atlantic Ocean are already being heavily taxed, or B, the king and the British Parliament could choose to impose taxes on the colonists, who at this point in time pay pennies compared to the citizens living in England. Now, this isn't a very hard decision for the king and the British government. They are going to choose to tax the colonists living in the colonies for a few reasons. The first of which being, those colonists don't really pay taxes. Secondly, the king and the British government view the French and Indian war debts as a responsibility of the colonists. After all, the war was fought to protect the colonists from the hated French and the merciless savage Indians. It's only fair that the colonists, therefore, pay for the cost of that war. And finally, the colonists live an ocean away compared to the English citizens who live just outside the castle walls, and when they are greeted with no taxes and no doubt complain, they are so far away that the king and the rest of the British government won't be bothered by the inevitable whining and crying. And as you know, this wasn't a welcome development from the colonists' viewpoint. Cry and whine, and more they did. Here you can see one of the less than satisfied ways in which the colonists responded to the new taxes. They tarred and feathered those tasked with collecting those taxes. Now, I used to think this was a harmless prank, and perhaps you did too. But know this, in order to get the tar in a closer to liquid state as opposed to its room temperature solid, you have to heat that tar to an extremely hot temperature, which means when the tar was poured onto a tax collector, it was scalding hot. And when scalding hot tar hits the human body, it tends to slough off the skin. So your skin slides right off. And here's a fun fact. You need your skin to live. True story. So this wasn't as much a harmless prank as it was an assault or perhaps even attempted murder. Ah, good times. We also saw events like the Boston Massacre further up the ante in the colonial response to new British taxes. You might remember a few hundred angry and possibly inebriated Bostonians surrounding a tax house protected by half a dozen British soldiers. And eventually, angry words thrown by colonists were soon paired with snowballs packed with ice and rocks, and eventually, one of the British soldiers fired his musket, which led to another volley from his comrades. In the end, 5 colonists lost their lives, which was capitalized on by rebellious colonists who soon began referring to this event as a massacre, although the facts laid before you, perhaps not a massacre you envision when you first hear the term. Things really came to a head when a gang of America's most beloved cartoon characters, dressed as Native Americans, stormed 3 British merchant ships anchored in the Boston harbor and, in an act of protest, proceeded to dump, in today's dollars, over $1 million of tea into the Boston harbor. It was said that a month later you could dip your mug into the Boston Harbor and pull out a salty cup of tea. All these previous acts committed by the American colonists really were the equivalent of a child throwing a tantrum in the grocery store because they can't get what they want. Up until this point, there really wasn't any talk of independence or forming their own nation. But that was about to change. In 1776, the leaders of the 13 colonies decided to hold another meeting in Philadelphia to discuss the next steps in getting Britain to repeal or get rid of the despised taxes they'd been imposing since the end of the French and Indian War. This had been done once before, so this being the second meeting, this group becomes known as the Second Continental Congress, and it's here that they begin in very hushed voices, because this would have been considered treason, plotting against the government. They begin discussing the idea of breaking away from Mother England. The meeting takes place in a building that will ultimately become known as Independence Hall. After much heated discussion, the dangerous step of declaring independence is agreed upon, and the Second Continental Congress decided to form a 5-person committee to draft a declaration, a statement, explaining not just to the colonies and to England, but to the rest of the world why they felt they must take this most dramatic step and formally separate from England. This declaration, of course, will become one of the most important documents in American history, and it is, of course, the Declaration of Independence. On this committee, there will be some very notable names. You will find the red-haired Virginian, who will, in about 15 years from this point in time, become the 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Additionally, serving as Jefferson's primary editor is one of the most accomplished Americans of all time, Benjamin Franklin, who himself probably would have been a president. However, by the time they create the position, he was some 80 years young, in a time when most people lived to be about 40. But in his lifetime, Franklin had accomplished much. He had invented the lightning rod, the Franklin stove, the bifocals. He created the first public library in Philadelphia, published a successful magazine that still exists today called Poor Richard's Almanac, which contained many witty sayings like "no gains without pain," which you might recognize as "no pain, no gain." And he'll be instrumental in convincing the French to come to our aid during the Revolutionary War. So he's done a lot. We also have John Adams on this crew. He, of course, will go on to become the 2nd President of the United States. Also, though, and somewhat less recognized, were 2 men by the names of Robert Livingston and Roger Sherman, who rounded out this committee tasked with an all-important history-changing responsibility. Understand that in this group, Jefferson was the one who served as the primary author. It's Jefferson's words that you read in the Declaration. Now, many of his ideas were borrowed from European philosophers known as the Enlightenment thinkers, who were, for the time, preaching some pretty radical ideas about people's rights and the role of the government. But Jefferson gets top billing and credit for what becomes one of, if not the most significant documents in American history. When talking about the Declaration, I generally use a couple of similes to drive home the point as to the Declaration's significance. The first simile is that the Declaration of Independence is like a birth certificate, and here you can see a visual representation of that hypothetical simile. Hopefully this simile makes sense. The Declaration of Independence is the document that marked the birth of the United States. When those old dead white guys that are your founding fathers put those words down on paper and agreed as a Second Continental Congress to send this document to King George III and publish it for all the world to see, That marked the first day that the United States existed. We were born as a nation, if you will. So that day that it was formally approved, July 4th, 1776, is considered the birthday of the United States. And every year, we celebrate it with parties and fireworks, just like many other birthdays. The second simile compares the Declaration of Independence to a breakup note. As an aside, let me share with you one of my most favorite breakup notes. I, however, did not write this one, but I admire the artistry, and I hope you will too. Dear Aaron, you are like the sunshine in the rain. Your smile is better than 100 million sparkly trampolines. So it is with deep regret that I must inform you that I think we should cut our relationship short. Some great technique in there. You build your soon-to-be ex up before gently letting them down. Much better than the sloppy "it's not you, it's me," which we all know means it's totally you. But remember, the ultimate goal of the Declaration of Independence was to force a separation. It officially and formally separated the 13 colonies from England's control and influence and set them off on their own independent path of their choosing. Much like a beleaguered person in a relationship casting off their ball and chain and going out on their own to see what else is out there. When you look at and break down the Declaration of Independence, and this is something we usually do in class, you find amidst all the eloquently written words that there are three main parts to the Declaration, which isn't an easy read for most 8th graders. However, I must admit to it being one of my favorite pieces of writing. Although, at your current age, I would be surprised if you felt the same in attempting to read it now. The introduction, speaking in very inspiring terms as to this belief that today isn't all that radical, but back in 1776 would have been somewhat out there. But in the initial part of the Declaration, Jefferson expresses the idea that all people are born with, and he uses the term inalienable, but all people are born with certain unalienable rights that can't be taken away, nor do they have to be given by someone in government. He mentions life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as rights that all human beings are born with. Again, understand that today we say, duh, but back then this idea was not commonplace and was only beginning to be discussed by a small number of people, many of whom were European philosophers, again, known as the Enlightenment thinkers. The next part of the Declaration, and this is the longest part of the Declaration of Independence, is a list of complaints regarding the king and his treatment of the colonists. It reads, "He has imposed taxes on us without our consent. He has sent unwanted soldiers to the colonies to harass us. He has held meetings in faraway and distant places to fatigue us into agreeing with him. He has imprisoned our sailors on the high seas and forced them to serve in the Royal Navy." The he that is repeatedly mentioned is King George III, the current King of England. So Jefferson has begun with the idea that everyone is born with basic human rights. And here are all the ways in which the king has violated those rights, which leads to the knockout punch. As a result of all those repeated violations, the colonies must now officially separate from England and its authority over the colonies. This is the part where the Declaration of Independence lives up to its name. They have stated or declared their separation or independence from English authority. Now understand that the king didn't simply read this declaration and glumly and defeatedly sigh, "We've lost the colonies." Oh no, his response was more, "I'll show you," and a little matter called the Revolutionary War had to play out before England recognized the United States as its own independent nation. Lastly, it's important to mention, to avoid confusion, a couple of things, for lack of a better word, that the DOI is not. The Declaration of Independence is not a plan for government. There is no mention of a president or a Congress or any new system of government that's going to come later with documents like the Articles of Confederation and the United States Constitution. Understand that the Declaration of Independence simply ended our relationship with England's government and set us off on our own independent path, free from English control. The Declaration of Independence is not a plan for government.